So in Vim, there are a lot of different plugins to do things like LF integration, Ranger integration, FZF integration, and a bunch of other applications that run inside of your terminal integrated into Vim. But why use all of these different plugins when you can just use one plugin that handles all of it? So today we're going to be looking at something called Floaterm, which basically what it does is wraps around the terminal built into Vim and neovim and sticks it inside of a floating window. And alongside of that, it has a bunch of wrappers for really popular applications like LF, Ranger, FZF. So you can actually use this terminal and do things like select files and other things like that without having to have all of these other plugins that are dedicated to that one application. So let's actually go see how this works. Every day that I do a new video on Vim, I feel like it's just getting closer and closer to just being Emacs, and maybe one day I'll try out Emacs, but for now I'm going to just stick with Vim because I think some of the stuff that it can do is really, really cool. So if you don't know, in Vim and in neovim, it actually has an integrated terminal. Now, I didn't know about this until maybe a couple of days ago, but if we run the terminal command, what this is going to do is actually open up a terminal inside of neovim. Now, this isn't actually perfect, and there's a couple of reasons why you might want to use Floaterm instead of this. So if we just go into insert mode, that'll actually take us to the command prompt, and we can open up things like LF, and we can open up a file in here. So let's open up, say, this random script here. Now, you might notice there's a bit of a problem here. So what you would expect that to do is open up that file, I guess, inside of that outer Vim instance, but it doesn't actually do that. And you might be able to notice from the two status bars down here and my two Netru windows. So what's actually happened here is we've opened up a shell inside of Vim, and then inside of that shell, we've opened up Vim again. So we've actually got two instances of Vim running right now, and the outer one's basically doing absolutely nothing. So I think the best way to, I guess, describe this is to show you the process of actually quitting out of this window. So to actually get back to this outer Vim instance, what we have to do is first quit out of this file, then quit out of my terminal file manager, then quit out of the terminal, and now we're actually back inside of Vim. So there was a couple of extra layers there that didn't really need to be there, and this is where Floaterm can actually be really useful. Now, the terminal is a little bit different over in regular Vim, but the concept still basically holds true. So if we open up the terminal command in here it's a split instead of taking up your entire screen. I don't know why it defaults differently like that, but that's sort of what it does. So the exact same problem exists here, but at least when you're using regular Vim, it'll be in a split, so you can actually still see what's going on down here. It's still not perfect, but it is a little bit better. Now back in neovim, I can show you what Floaterm is going to do. So you actually can do Floaterm in basically the same way we just saw before. So if we just open up a new Floaterm instance by just running Floaterm and then running new, this opens up basically the same thing we just saw before, but this time it's just in a floating window rather than taking up our entire screen. So if we were to open up something like LF in here, and we go into my scripts, and I don't know, let's just open up this script right here. So this is basically the same thing that we saw before, but this time it's just in a floating window. But you don't have to use Floaterm in this way, and this is where Floaterm gets super useful. So if instead of doing it like this, what we do is we actually open up Floaterm with a command. So let's do something like Floaterm new and opened up with the LF command. Now, at this stage, you might not really be seeing anything that different. It's just automatically opened up LF. Why is this different? Well, what this has actually done is opened up LF with the LF wrapper. So let's go into my scripts folder and let's open up a script in here. And this time what it's going to do is instead of opening up inside of this floating window, it's going to open up inside of this outer Vim window. So let's just open up this one here. Bam. Worked perfectly fine. And the same thing's going to be true for using things like Ranger. I don't have Ranger installed, but I do have FZF installed. So if we go Floaterm new, FZF, so this opens up an FZF window, and let's give that a second to load everything. I don't know, let's open up D-Man or something. Yeah, we'll open up this script here and give that a second. There we go. Now, I don't know why I was a little slow there. I think that might have just been the fact that I was recording. I've never actually seen it do that. Generally, it's going to be pretty much instant, but if you are using slower hardware, then I guess that problem probably could crop up a bit more often. So when you're actually making a new floating term window, you don't actually just have to use the default settings that you've set with your variables. You can actually go and configure it while you're actually making it, but for the most part, I would recommend just setting this to something like a key mapping. So the way you actually go and configure this is basically just passing in options. So let's say we want to set the height to be, I don't know, 0.6, and we want the width to be something like 0.4. So if we run this now, as you can see, the sizing has changed a little bit, but let's actually try something a little bit different, just so it's a bit clearer that it actually has changed. So if we just quit out of this one here, and let's just rerun that same command, but this time let's change the width to be 0.9. So basically what that means is 90% of the entire Vim width. So we run this now, and as you can see, that is 90% of the Vim window. And that's not all that can be configured. So I've got this long command here that actually shows you most of the things you can configure. So if we just paste that in, so float term new -- height equals 0.6. So that's 60% of the Vim height and 40% of the Vim width. And then we have the win type, and let's just change the win type from being floating to being normal, because floating is actually the default mode. So set that to normal. Normal will basically open up in a split. The name is basically the name of the actual window. So with the commands like float term show, float term hide, you can basically hide and show a window based on its name. And then the position should be pretty obvious, and top left isn't actually a valid position for win type normal, so let's just set it to left. So if we open this window up now, it's going to appear over on this side right here, and run this. As you can see, it's appeared as a left split. Now, when it comes to the position, the types of positions you can set depend on the mode you're actually in. So in win type normal, you can set top, right, bottom, and left. But in win type floating, you have top, right, bottom, and left. But then you have things like center, top left, top right, so on and so forth. And then also auto, which places at the cursor position. So moving on from float term new, there's a couple of commands like float term toggle, show, hide, next, and previous, which are all pretty self-explanatory, but they also are a little bit annoying to use in the situation that you're actually going to want to use them. So if we just toggle the terminal, what that's going to do is actually re-show the terminal. Now, once we're actually in this bit here, there's not actually a way to get back to command mode from what I've seen. I think you actually have to quit out of this terminal to actually get back out. Now, I know I can click up here, and that takes me back into focusing on that window. So I assume there is some sort of binding for this, but I haven't found anything in the float term documentation. I haven't found any reference to it inside of the Vim documentation, so I'm not actually sure how this would work. But luckily, if you do things like set up key bindings do still work from here. So key bindings on things that obviously don't print out characters, so things like your F keys, or if you do control bindings or alt bindings. So I've got float term toggle bound to F12, and basically that's just going to show and hide the terminal. And then I've got next and prev set up to F10 and F11. So if I press F10, what that's going to do is cycle previously. If I press F11, that's going to cycle next. And I'm sure there's some way to actually run the commands when you're actually in terminal mode, but I haven't found a way to do so. So if someone knows how that works, then feel free to let me know. And according to the float term documentation, there's one command that exists that I don't think actually exists. So if I quit out of this terminal, what you're going to see is there's not a command called float term kill. Now what float term kill is going to do should be pretty obvious. It should actually kill the terminal window. But it doesn't seem to exist. I can't tab complete it. If we tab complete from float term, there's no command in here called float term kill. But if I go and search for it over here, float term kill, it seems to exist in the documentation. So unless it was removed or it's currently being added, it doesn't seem to actually exist right now. So the only way to actually kill one of the windows is to basically just exit out of the terminal, or other ways you can go and regularly kill a terminal. And there are two other commands that actually do exist. Now, one of them, it has the same problem as things like cycle, next, and show, and hide. And that is float term update. Now, what float term update is supposed to do is let you do things like update the width of a window, update the height of it, just change the various attributes in it. So the problem with this is I haven't found a way to actually run the command when you're actually in terminal mode, and you can't run it outside of terminal mode So if we just run it like this, as you're going to see, it says I need to be in a floating window to change the window options. But I don't know of a way to actually run the command when I'm actually in the floating window, so I don't know how that actually works. Once again, if someone knows how to run that command when you're actually in terminal mode, let me know. But from what I see, that there's not a way to do that. Obviously, you could map that to a key binding, but this is something you're probably going to want to change on the fly. You probably don't just want to have this be something that's actually static. And then we also have float term send, which I'm pretty sure just doesn't actually work. So what float term send is going to let you do is send a command to a job in a floating terminal. Now, the problem here is it actually lets you actually send a command. The problem, though, is that you can't specify the name of the terminal you want to send it to. You might be saying, well, can't you just use the name command here? Well, yes, you can, but it actually interprets the name command incorrectly. So if we just run float term send --name equals test, and let's send the command ls. Now, what it's going to do here is interpret the name of the terminal as --name equals test ls. Now, obviously, that's not how it's supposed to work. What it should do is interpret the name as test and then run the command ls as it shows in the example right here. So I'm guessing this command doesn't actually work properly, but luckily, the main reason to use float term isn't things like send and update, it's for the integration. So if we go down a bit, you can see some of the integrations that actually do exist. So besides the stuff I mentioned earlier, there's also an integration for things like Git, for actually FCF I mentioned, but there's FFF, there's NNN, LF I mentioned already, Ranger, VIFM, LazyGit. So LazyGit is actually a terminal-based Git interface. There's an integration with a Python shell, and there's a bunch of other stuff like that as well. So this is why you might actually want to use float term. So instead of having a bunch of different plugins to do things like Ranger integration and Git integration and FZF integration, and maybe even the Python shell, instead of doing all that, what you can do instead is just do all of it in this single plugin. So one last thing I do want to talk about is just a little bit of the configuration. So all of those values that we were setting with float term new, they can all be set just as regular variables just so they can be the default values. So let's say you always want your windows to take up, I don't know, 90% of the width and 50% of the height, and you always want them to show the window title. So all of those settings can be done with just regular variables. So things like setting the win type, that'll be done with g:float_win type, or g:float_win title for the window title. Then we have the width, the height, the window blend. Now, window blend only works on neovim just because in regular Vim and neovim, this plugin will behave a little bit differently, and the way that they've actually integrated floating windows is a little bit different. So some of the settings are just for neovim because regular Vim right now can't actually handle them. But there's a bunch of other stuff in here as well, so I'm not going to go into all of these, but if you want to come check them out for yourself, then there'll be a link to the GitHub page down below. And obviously, you can also check on the float term documentation inside of Vim. So if we just go over to my nvim configuration, we can see what I'm actually setting. So if we go down a bit to float term. So I'm not doing a ton of configuration. There's only really a couple of things I'm doing in here. So I've got one binding in here to Alt-T, and this basically will open up a new terminal window. So this is just a bit of an easier way than having to write float term new. So let's just quit out of this one. And the main thing that I'll normally run float term with is with LF. So if I run Alt-R, what that's going to do is directly open up the LF command. So I can go and actually select another file in here, and that will then automatically jump to that file. And really the only other settings I've got in here are for setting some of the other key bindings, so things like float term toggle, float term next, float term previous, and also I've got another binding in here for float term new, but that one should probably be removed. So all of the commands we were running earlier, so new, previous, next, hide, show, kill, and toggle, except for kill because that one doesn't actually exist, all of those can be given key bindings by just setting the variable for float term underscore keymap underscore whatever the command you're running is. So in the case of toggle, it would be float term underscore keymap underscore toggle, or for hide, float term underscore keymap underscore hide. Pretty straightforward how that works. And obviously you could just do it in the regular sort of Vim mapping way where you do it like I've done up here. either of these methods will work, whichever one you feel a bit more comfortable doing. So that's pretty much everything for what Floaterm can do, and as for the installation, it's pretty straightforward how it works. All I'm doing is in my Vim plug block, I'm actually just downloading the plugins. So plug Volcus, I don't know how to say this name, /vim-floatterm, and if you're using a different plugin manager, I don't think any of the others are described on the GitHub page, but I presume that you actually no, dayin.nvim is. So if you're using dayin.nvim, that's the form it would need to be in, and if you're using any other sort of plugin manager, then I assume you probably know how that plugin manager actually works. Now, if you're using neovim, there's one other thing you probably will want to download as well. So if we go down to this section right here, you're going to want to download a program called neovim-remote, and this can be downloaded with pip. So pip3 install neovim-remote, and that's just to make sure that some of the integrations in neovim are actually going to work. For whatever reason you need this extra dependency that isn't actually a thing you need just with regular Vim. I presume it just has something to do with the way that neovim actually handles its floating windows. So I think that's pretty much everything I wanted to say about Floaterm. And if you just ignore some of the weird inconsistencies that exist within the documentation, and I guess you set up key bindings to make it so it's considerably easier to actually run some of the commands. Once again, if there is a way to actually get into command mode when you've actually opened up a terminal, let me know, because I haven't found a way to do so, and I did look for it for quite a bit. I could have just completely missed out on it and just, I don't know, I'm completely blind. If there is something there, let me know and I'll pin the comment or something like that, because I do think that these floating windows actually are pretty cool. And if there is a way to, I guess, switch your focus between them, then I would like to know that, because that will make it considerably easier to actually use this plugin. So I think that's pretty much everything I wanted to talk about in today's video. But before I go, I wanted to thank my patrons. So a special thank you to Joachim, Craig, Nathan, Andrew, Montezar, Peter D. Road, Tony, Chris, Donald, and Zilva. If you want to join the Patreon, there'll be a link to that down below, as well as my Amazon affiliate links where you can buy the Guris in this channel, or anything else you want, and I'll get a small kickback for it. Also, want to go check out my podcast. That is Tech of a Tea, available on Library and YouTube, and the audio version available wherever you listen to podcasts. Also, remember to go check out this channel, available on Library, BitTube, and BitChute. And remember to smash the like button and leave me a comment down below. And remember to subscribe and ring the little bell icon down below as well. So I think that's pretty much everything for me, and I'm out.